The massive blast doors of the Galactic Council chamber groaned open with the sound of grinding metal against an eternity of political tension. Through that doorway stepped a figure that would change the course of galactic history forever, though. None of the assembled alien dignitaries realized it yet. Ambassador Thomas Reed moved with the fluid precision of a predator, his perfectly tailored black diplomatic suit absorbing the chamber's harsh xenon lighting like a hungry void. But here's the thing about first impressions: they're usually wrong. Dead wrong. Reed's footsteps echoed across the crystalline floor with a weight that seemed to defy physics. Each step resonated through the chamber's quantum-stabilized foundation, creating vibrations that registered on instruments designed to detect stellar earthquakes. The assembled delegates, creatures from 47 different star systems, felt something primal stir in their genetic memory. Something that whispered of ancient predators and forgotten nightmares. The chamber itself was a monument to galactic unity. Carved from a single massive crystal formation and suspended in the heart of the Nexus Station. Bioluminescent panels cast eerie shadows that seemed to bend and twist around Reed's presence. Representatives from across the galaxy filled the tiered seating, the insectoid hive queens with their clicking mandibles, the gaseous ethereals whose forms constantly shifted between dimensions, and the massive stone-like titans who hadn't moved in decades, but today they were all moving, shifting. Uncomfortable Council Prime Malthor rose from his throne, his 12-foot frame casting a shadow that had intimidated countless species into submission. His voice boomed across the chamber like the roar of a dying star. Silence. The word carried the authority of someone who had never been disobeyed, never been challenged, never been truly afraid. That was about to change. Human Malthor continued, his 4 eyes blazing with contempt. You stand before the combined might of 47 star systems. Your pathetic species has exactly 36 hours to withdraw from the Outer Rim territories or face complete annihilation. The gallery erupted in approving roars and chittering sounds that would have terrified any sane diplomat. Energy weapons hummed to life as security forces prepared for the inevitable human panic. After all, every species faced with the Council's ultimatum had the same reaction: terror, followed by desperate bargaining, followed by complete capitulation. But Red just smiled, and that smile carried something that made the chamber's temperature sensors begin their first round of inexplicable readings. The atmospheric processors started working overtime, trying to compensate for heat that was simply vanishing into nowhere. Several delegates noticed their breath beginning to mist, though the environmental controls showed perfect regulation. Now here's where things get interesting, Reed said, his voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in normal space-time. You see, you've made a rather significant miscalculation. The sound of his words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The chamber's advanced audio systems, designed to translate thousands of alien languages simultaneously, began issuing error codes. Several delegates' sensory organs evolved over millions of years to detect danger, were screaming warnings in frequencies their conscious minds couldn't process. Reed approached the central podium with movements that seemed too fluid, too precise, too deliberately controlled. Around him, the assembled representatives began exhibiting signs of distress their species hadn't shown in millennia. The Hive Queen's mandibles clicked in patterns associated with ancient fear responses. The ethereal's gaseous forms contracted into defensive configurations. Even the stone-like titans began to shift for the first time in living memory. But here's what none of them understood yet: they weren't looking at a diplomat. They were looking at something far older, far more dangerous, and far more patient than any of them could comprehend. Honored Council, Reed began, his perfectly human appearance beginning to seem less like biology and more like a carefully maintained illusion. I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what humanity actually represents in this galaxy. The Chamber's artificial intelligence systems, quantum computers capable of processing the thoughts of entire civilizations, began issuing the first of many warnings they would broadcast in the coming minutes. Warning signals that would soon reach every corner of known space, alerting civilizations to something that defied every natural law they thought they understood. Something in Reed's tone made the most advanced technology in the galaxy recognize that it was in the presence of a force that existed outside the normal parameters of reality itself. The AI systems began running diagnostics, searching for explanations that didn't exist in any database, for precedents that had been deliberately erased from galactic history. The delegates sensed it too. That primal recognition that every sentient species carries in their genetic code. The knowledge that somewhere in the universe there are things that should not be disturbed, should not be challenged, should not be awakened, and humanity had just walked one of those things into the most secure location in the galaxy, dressed it in a diplomatic suit, and called it an ambassador. The temperature continued to drop. The shadows continued to bend. And Thomas Reed continued to smile that perfectly human, perfectly terrifying smile. What happened next would reshape every species' understanding of their place in the cosmic order. But first, they had to survive the revelation of what they had just threatened to annihilate. The real question wasn't whether humanity would survive the Council's ultimatum. The real question was whether the Council would survive humanity's response. Speaking of survival and growth, just like compound interest transforms small investments into fortunes over time, the power of understanding universal forces can compound your knowledge exponentially. Check out my next video about the incredible power of compounding that shapes everything from economies to civilizations. Malthor's laugh erupted from his massive throat like the sound of a collapsing star system. The vibrations shook the chamber's crystalline foundations, causing hairline fractures to spider across walls that had withstood the gravitational pull of black holes. His amusement was genuine, the kind of condescending mirth that comes from absolute certainty in one's superiority. Misunderstanding? He repeated, his 4 eyes blazing with the fire of 1,000 conquered worlds. Your pathetic species crawled out of a backwater system mere centuries ago. You have no warships that matter, no allies worth mentioning, no leverage whatsoever. You will comply with our demands, or you will be erased from existence. The assembled delegates erupted in a cacophony of approval that would have shattered human eardrums, chittering, roaring, and harmonizing in frequencies that spanned the electromagnetic spectrum. They celebrated what they believed was humanity's inevitable doom. The sound was intoxicating, the collective voice of 47 civilizations united in their certainty of victory. But here's the thing about certainty. It's usually the last thing you feel before everything goes horribly wrong. Commander Vex of the Hegemony rose from her seat, her 8-foot frame rippling with biomechanical enhancements that could level city blocks. She slammed her plasma weapon against the floor with such force that the impact created a small crater in the supposedly indestructible surface. The sound rang out like a death knell. She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had personally overseen the extinction of 17 different species. 47 combined fleets await our signal, human, she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a battle. Each fleet capable of glassing entire star systems. Your homeworld will burn first, followed by every pathetic colony you've infected with your presence. The gallery roared its approval again. Energy weapons hummed to life throughout the chamber. As security forces prepared for what they assumed would be humanity's desperate final plea, the Hive Queens clicked their mandibles in patterns that translated to feast preparation. The ethereals began shifting into their combat configurations, their gaseous forms solidifying into crystalline armor that could withstand stellar radiation. Even the ancient titans, who had slumbered through the rise and fall of entire civilizations, stirred from their meditation to witness what they believed would be humanity's extinction. Reed, standing at the center of this storm of hostility, did something that stopped every delegate cold. He adjusted his cufflinks, not frantically, not nervously, with the kind of deliberate precision that a surgeon uses when making the final cut, or a musician uses when striking the last note of a symphony. The gesture was so perfectly controlled, so utterly calm, that it created a moment of cognitive dissonance in every observer. "I was hoping we could resolve this peacefully," Reed said, his voice carrying that same strange resonance that made the chambers. AI systems issue increasingly urgent warnings. Malthor's fury reached new heights. His massive frame expanded as Battle hormone flooded his system, a biochemical response that had evolved over millions of years to intimidate enemies into submission. Peaceful? He roared, spittle flying from his mandibles. Your species spreads across the galaxy like a disease, claiming worlds without permission, ignoring established boundaries, contaminating everything you touch with your primitive presence. The irony was delicious, wasn't it? Here was a council, representing species that had conquered, enslaved, exterminated their way across the galaxy, calling humanity a disease. But Reed didn't point out the hypocrisy. He simply stood there, smiling that perfectly human smile that was becoming less human by the moment. There will be no peace, Malthor continued, his voice rising to a crescendo that shook dust from the chamber's ancient fixtures. Only your complete and total extinction. We will burn your world, scatter your ashes across the void, and ensure that no trace of your pathetic existence remains to contaminate the galaxy. The delegates cheered again, but this time something was different. The sound seemed muffled, as if the very air was becoming thicker, more resistant to vibration. The chamber's atmospheric processors began working overtime, trying to compensate for conditions that shouldn't exist in normal space-time. That's when the first delegates noticed it. The shadows, they were behaving wrong. Instead of radiating outward from the chamber's light sources, they were bending inward, drawn toward Reed like iron filings to a magnet. The effect was subtle at first, just a slight distortion that caught the corner of the eye. The kind of thing you might dismiss as a trick of the light, but it was getting stronger. The chamber's environmental systems began issuing failure warnings. As something ancient and terrible stirred beneath Reed's human facade, temperature sensors registered readings that violated basic thermodynamics. Gravity detectors showed fluctuations that suggested the presence of massive objects that weren't there. Reality itself seemed to be warping around the perfectly dressed diplomat. Several delicate species that had survived cosmic catastrophes, stellar wars, and the death of entire galaxies began experiencing something they hadn't felt in millennia. Fear, not the tactical concern of a military engagement, but the primal terror that comes from recognizing that you're in the presence of something that exists outside the natural order. The hive queens. Mandibles stopped clicking. The ethereal's forms began contracting into defensive configurations. Even the mighty titans started shifting for the first time in living memory, their stone-like bodies creaking as muscles that had been dormant for centuries began to flex. But Reed just stood there, adjusting his tie with the same deliberate precision he'd used on his cufflinks. His smile never wavered, never changed, never lost that perfectly human quality that was becoming more terrifying by the moment. You know, he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than galactic extinction, it's fascinating how every species makes the same mistake. You see size, you see numbers, you see technology, and you assume you understand power. Chamber's AI systems began broadcasting warnings in languages that predated most of the assembled civilizations. Ancient protocols buried in quantum storage for eons were suddenly active, screaming about containment breaches and cosmic-level threats. But here's what you don't understand, Reed continued, his voice now carrying harmonics that made the chamber's foundation stones vibrate in frequencies that shouldn't exist. Humanity didn't conquer the darkness between stars. We befriended it. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The shadows deepened. And every delegate in the chamber suddenly realized that they might have made the biggest mistake in galactic history. The real question wasn't whether humanity would survive the Council's ultimatum. The real question was whether the galaxy would survive humanity's response, just like compound interest. Small misunderstandings can grow into massive consequences. Over time, want to learn how the power of compounding affects everything from civilizations to your personal wealth? Check out my next video about the incredible force that shapes our universe. The moment had arrived. The point of no return where diplomacy dies and something far more primal takes its place. Reed's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow that soft tone carried more weight than all of Malthor's thunderous roars combined. Very well, he said, and the words seemed to echo from places that shouldn't exist. The chamber's quantum stabilizer's technology so advanced it could maintain Reality itself in the presence of black holes began screaming alerts that no engineer had ever heard before. Warning signals cascaded across every screen, each one more urgent than the last. If diplomacy has failed, Reed continued, his perfectly human features beginning to blur at the edges like a photograph left too long in the sun. Then let me introduce humanity's true ambassador. You know that moment in every horror movie when the protagonist finally realizes they're not dealing with something normal? That split second of recognition when the brain tries to process information that violates every natural law? Every delegate in that chamber was experiencing it simultaneously. Malthor's response was pure instinct. Pure survival programming that had been hardwired into his species over millions of years of evolution. He raised his primary weapon, a plasma cannon capable of vaporizing starship hulls, and his voice cracked with something that might have been fear. Security, he roared, his 4 eyes blazing with desperate fury.
Aye!
Vaporize this insect. The chamber's defense grid activated with the sound of 1,000 thunderclaps. Energy weapons that had been designed to repel entire invasion fleets swiveled toward Reed, their targeting systems locking onto his human form with mechanical precision. The air itself began to ionize as power levels that could level entire city blocks prepared to unleash their fury. But here's where things get really interesting. And I mean universe-alteringly interesting. The weapons fired, concentrated barrage of energy that would have turned a mountain into vapor, struck Reed directly. The light was so intense that several delegates' optical sensors automatically shut down to prevent permanent damage. The sound was so overwhelming that the chamber's acoustic dampeners overloaded. And then, nothing. No explosion, no vaporization. No screaming. It's just the gradually fading echo of weapons that had struck something that apparently didn't follow the rules of physics. Because Reed was still standing there. Still smiling, still wearing that perfectly pressed diplomatic suit. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on your perspective. The energy beams had passed through him, not around him, not deflected by some invisible shield. Through him. Like he was made of shadow and starlight, like he was a projection from another dimension, like he was something that existed in the spaces. Between atoms, the silence that followed was the kind that comes just before the universe decides to rewrite all its rules. I am not Thomas Reed, the entity said, and now its voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. From the walls, from the floor, from the spaces between the delegates' thoughts. The chamber's audio systems couldn't locate the source because the source was reality itself. I am what your species call the Voidwalker. The name hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates began accessing their historical databases, searching for references that their ancestors had tried desperately to forget. The hive. Queen's mandibles clicked in patterns that translated to ancient fear. The ethereal's forms began dissipating as they attempted to phase out of normal space-time. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's not from something that existed in the spaces between existence itself. I am the ending of worlds, the entity continued. Its voice now carrying harmonics that made the chamber's foundation stones weep tears of crystallized fear. The silence between galaxies. It's the darkness that consumed your predecessors. And that's when the real show began. The human suit, that perfect illusion of diplomatic propriety, began dissolving. Not tearing or burning or exploding. Dissolving, like smoke caught in a gentle breeze, morning mist touched by sunlight, like the last breath of a dying star. What remained was something that the human mind simply wasn't equipped to process. The delegates' optical sensors registered input, but their brains refused to translate it into comprehensible images. It was a walking absence, a living void that devoured light and sound and hope itself. Imagine looking at the space between spaces. The darkness that existed before the first star was born, the silence that will remain after the last planet dies. Now imagine that darkness had learned to walk, to think, to choose its victims with deliberate precision. Several delegates simply shut down. Their consciousness, faced with sensory input that violated every natural law, opted for the safety of complete system failure. The lucky ones just fainted. The unlucky ones remained conscious. trapped in the presence of something that existed outside the normal parameters of reality. The entity's form, if it could be called a form, seemed to shift and flow like liquid. Darkness. Where it moved, light died. Where it stepped, sound ceased. Where it looked, matter itself began to question its right to exist. You demanded consequences, it said, its voice now coming from dimensions that the Council's science couldn't measure, couldn't understand, couldn't even properly detect. You threatened to burn human worlds. You promised extinction. The chamber's environmental systems began failing as the entity's presence grew stronger. Temperature readings showed impossible fluctuations. Gravity sensors registered fields that shouldn't exist. Reality itself began to fray at the edges. But did you never wonder? The entity continued, its attention turning toward Malthor like the gaze of a dying galaxy. Why such a young species expanded so fearlessly into the darkness? Between stars? Malthor's massive frame began to shake. Not from rage this time, but from something far more primal. His species had evolved on a world where the greatest predators were the size of buildings. It faced cosmic horrors that could devour planets. He had stared into the heart of collapsing stars without flinching, but this was different. This was the predator that other predators had nightmares about. The entity's form continued to shift and flow, revealing glimpses of something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. It was beautiful and terrible, ancient and eternal, patient and absolutely inevitable, and it was just getting started. The real question wasn't whether the Council would survive the next few minutes. The real question was whether the concept of survival itself would mean anything when this encounter was over. Just like compound interest transforms small investments into massive fortunes over time. Small choices can compound into universe-changing consequences. Want to discover how the power of compounding shapes everything from civilizations to your personal wealth? Check out my next video about this incredible force that governs our reality. Terror, beyond comprehension, swept through the chamber like a tsunami of pure existential dread. This wasn't the clean fear of battle or the calculated anxiety of political maneuvering. This was something far more primal, the kind of terror that reaches into your genetic code and whispers about predators that existed before your species learned to dream. The delegates witnessed what humanity had sent as their diplomat, and their minds struggled to process the impossible. The entity's true form was a living void, a walking apocalypse that didn't just threaten to destroy reality, consumed it. Where it moved, the very concept of existence became negotiable. You know that feeling when you realize you've been playing chess while your opponent has been playing a completely different game? That moment of dawning horror when you understand that every move you've made has been anticipated, every strategy you've employed has been accounted for? That's what hit every delegate simultaneously. The entity's voice resonated from everywhere, and nowhere at once, speaking through the quantum foam of space-time itself. You demanded war, it said, each word carrying the weight of collapsing stars. You threatened to burn human worlds. You promised extinction with the casual confidence of children playing with matches. The chamber's advanced translation systems began failing as they encountered concepts that didn't exist in any known language. How do you translate the sound of entropy? How do you interpret the voice of inevitable ending? But did you never wonder, the entity continued, its attention sweeping across the assembly like the gaze of a dying universe, why such a young species expanded so fearlessly into the dark between stars? That question hit like a physical blow. Because it was true, wasn't it? Every other species in the galaxy had expanded cautiously, carefully, always aware of the horrors that lurked in the void between worlds. They built massive fleets, developed planet-killing weapons, created alliances spanning star systems, all because they knew that space was hostile. That darkness was dangerous. That silence meant death. But humanity? Humanity had spread across the galaxy like they were taking a pleasant stroll through a neighborhood park. They sent out colony ships with names like Hope and New Beginning. They explored black holes with the casual curiosity of tourists. They treated the cosmic void like it was their personal backyard. Now they knew why. Malthor's mighty frame, 12 feet of evolved predator, enhanced with cybernetic implants that could crush starship, hulls began cracking under waves of existential dread. Not physical damage, but something far worse. His very concept of self was being challenged by the presence of something that existed outside the normal parameters of reality. What are you? He managed to whisper, his voice barely audible through vocal cords that had been designed to roar across battlefields. The entity's attention focused on him like the weight of a black hole's event horizon. I am why humans do not fear the void, it replied, its voice now carrying harmonics that made the chamber's quantum stabilizers, weep warnings in languages that predated most civilizations. But wait, it gets so much worse. I am why the Devourers fled this galaxy screaming, the entity continued, and several delegates' historical databases immediately began searching for references to the Devourers. The results were horrifying. The Devourers had been the galaxy's nightmare for millions of years, cosmic horrors that consumed entire star systems, leaving nothing but empty space and the echo of screams. They had vanished overnight. Every trace of them simply ... gone. I am why the precursor empire fell to eternal silence, the entity added. And now the chamber's AI systems were accessing records that had been sealed for eons, the precursors of the galaxy's first great civilization. Masters of technology that made current science look like stone tools. They had ruled for millions of years, their empires spanning entire galactic arms, until they didn't. Until they simply stopped existing, leaving behind only empty worlds and the kind of silence that makes you afraid to breathe. And now, the entity said, its form shifting and flowing like liquid darkness made manifest. I am why the Galactic Council will learn what it means to threaten those under my protection. The chamber's walls began to crack, not from force or pressure or any kind of physical stress. They cracked from the absence of everything that held them together. The fundamental forces that kept matter stable, the strong nuclear force. The weak nuclear force, electromagnetic interaction, began to question their own existence in the presence of something that existed outside their jurisdiction. Time itself seemed to slow as the entity's presence grew stronger. The chamber's chronometers began registering impossible readings. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes collapsed into microseconds. The flow of causality itself became fluid, negotiable, subject to the will of something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space-time. Several delegates began experiencing temporal displacement. They remembered events that hadn't happened yet, forgot things that were occurring in the present moment. Hive Queen's collective consciousness began fragmenting as their shared timeline became unstable. The ethereal's gaseous forms started phasing in and out of multiple dimensions simultaneously. But the most terrifying part wasn't what the entity was doing, it was what it wasn't doing, was holding back. This cosmic horror, this walking apocalypse, this living embodiment of entropy itself was showing restraint because it was still playing diplomat. You see, the entity said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than the fundamental nature of existence. Humanity didn't conquer the darkness between stars. We didn't defeat the cosmic horrors or develop weapons to fight the void. We did something far more dangerous. The pause stretched across eternity, filled with the sound of reality questioning its own existence. We made friends with them. Implications hit the chamber like a supernova of understanding. Every species in the galaxy had spent millions of years building defenses against the horrors of deep space. They had developed technologies, formed alliances, created entire civilizations dedicated to keeping the darkness at bay. But humanity had taken a different approach. Instead of fighting the monsters, they had invited them over for dinner. Instead of building walls against the void, they had opened diplomatic relations with it. And now, faced with the threat of extinction, humanity had sent their oldest ally. As their representative, the entity's form continued to shift and flow, revealing glimpses of something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality. It was patient, ancient, and absolutely inevitable. It was also, in its own incomprehensible way, loyal. The real question wasn't whether the council would survive the next few minutes. The real question was whether they would learn the lesson before it was too late. Just like compound interest, small alliances can grow into incredible partnerships over time. Want to discover how the power of compounding creates unexpected results in every aspect of life? Check out my next video about this fascinating force that shapes our universe. The emergency broadcast that had flooded the galaxies. Communication networks for the past 17 minutes finally fell silent. Across 47 star systems sensor, arrays that had been screaming warnings about reality-threatening anomalies gradually returned to normal readings. Emergency protocols that hadn't been activated since the precursor wars slowly powered down. The galaxy's collective panic began to subside, replaced by something far more unsettling, the dawning realization that everything had fundamentally changed. When the cosmic dust settled, the Galactic Council's ultimatum had been withdrawn. Out. Through negotiation, not through compromise, not through any diplomatic process that appeared in any textbook. It had been withdrawn through the simple, terrifying understanding that some forces transcend mortal comprehension entirely. The entity had returned to its human disguise, though now the illusion felt gossamer thin, like a costume that everyone knew was fake but nobody dared to acknowledge. Ambassador Reed stood before the traumatized delegates, his perfectly pressed suit restored, his diplomatic smile firmly in place. But underneath it all, something vast. An ancient watched through human eyes. "The colonies will remain," he announced to the assembly, his voice once again carrying human inflections instead of the harmonics of dying galaxies. The words were simple, matter-of-fact, delivered with the casual confidence of someone discussing lunch plans rather than galactic sovereignty. The delegates sat in stunned silence. These were beings who had conquered star systems, who had negotiated the fates of entire civilizations, who had stared down cosmic horrors and emerged victorious. Now they sat like children who had just learned that the monsters under their beds were not only real, but were willing to have a reasonable conversation about territorial boundaries. "Trade will continue," Reed continued, adjusting his diplomatic briefcase with the same casual precision he'd used throughout this encounter. "Shipping lanes will remain open. Commerce between our species will proceed as normal. And humanity will expand as it chooses, when it chooses, wherever it chooses." But here's where things get really interesting, paradigm-shifting interesting. But in return, he added, straightening his tie with the kind of casual precision that made every delegate remember what they had just witnessed. "You have my word that you will never see my true nature again, provided you never threaten humanity's children." The promise hung in the air like a sword suspended by a single thread. Not a threat, exactly. More like a weather report. Simple statement. Of cause and effect. Touch humanity's colonies. Experience something that existed beyond the normal parameters of reality. The chamber's atmospheric processors worked over time to maintain normal breathing conditions as the weight of that promise settled over the assembly. Several delegates began calculating the implications. If this entity was humanity's ally, what did that say about humanity's other relationships? What other cosmic horrors had they somehow convinced to become their friends? As Reed turned to leave, Malthor found his voice. The Council Prime's words came out as barely a whisper, but in the profound silence of the chamber, they carried with perfect clarity. What are you to them?" Reed paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the massive blast door that had seemed so imposing just an hour ago. Now, it looked like tissue paper. It's a flimsy barrier that existed only because something vast and patient chose to acknowledge its presence. His smile, when he turned back, was perfectly human and perfectly terrifying. The kind of expression that would haunt the dreams of entire civilizations for generations to come. "I am what they found in the void between worlds," he said, his voice carrying just the faintest echo of cosmic harmonics. "And what they befriended when wiser species would have fled screaming into the darkness of deep space." The pause stretched. Across eternity, filled with implications that would reshape galactic politics for millennia to come. "I am their ally, their guardian, their friend," Reed continued, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. "I am the reason they named their exploration vessels Curiosity and Friendship, while other species build dreadnoughts and battlecruisers." The chamber doors began to seal behind him with a whisper of finality, but his voice carried clearly. Through the diminishing gap, and why the universe learned to fear a species that names its warships hope and harmony while keeping death itself as their diplomatic cores. The doors sealed with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a chapter in galactic history. The council sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology, their numbers, their military might, or their economic power. It was their ability to make friends with the very forces that destroyed. Civilizations think about it while every other species in the galaxy had spent millions of years building defenses against cosmic horrors. Humanity had somehow convinced those same horrors to become their allies. While others developed weapons to fight the darkness, humans had invited it over for coffee and conversation. The implications were staggering. If humanity could befriend entities that existed outside normal space-time, what other alliances had they formed? What other cosmic forces had they somehow convinced to become their partners rather than their enemies? The Galactic Council would spend the next several decades trying to understand how a species, barely out of its technological infancy, had managed to accomplish what the greatest civilizations in galactic history had never even attempted. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps wisdom sometimes came not from age or experience, but from the simple willingness to extend friendship to the unknown. Rather than immediately reaching for weapons, the galaxy had learned a valuable lesson that day. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't technology or military might, it's the ability to make friends with your monsters instead of fighting them. And humanity, it seemed, was very good at making friends. Speaking of powerful, forces that compound over time, the ability to build unexpected alliances and relationships can transform small opportunities into incredible success. Want to discover how the power of compounding creates exponential growth in every aspect of life? Check out my next video. It's about this fundamental force that shapes everything from civilizations to personal wealth. The end.